that urge to put pen to paper, fingers to keyboard, we all know it, right? From jotting down a quick grocery list to maybe pouring our thoughts into a journal, writing is just, well, it's part of life.
It really is.
But what happens when that urge becomes something
More.
like an undeniable drive?
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this idea of graphomania.
Graphomania, okay.
Yeah, we've gathered some really interesting material on it. The goal is to unpack what it is, how people have thought about it differently, and maybe what it tells you, the listener, about our fascination with writing.
Okay, graphomania. The name itself sounds pretty intense. Let's break it down. What actually defines it?
Well, at its core, graphomania is basically an overwhelming impulse to write.
An impulse.
Yeah. And the word, it comes from ancient Greek. You've got graphin.
Which means to write.
Exactly, to write. And then mania.
Okay, mania.
Yeah.
Does that sound like madness?
Madness frenzy.
Yeah.
So you put it together, it's literally a kind of writing frenzy.
Writing frenzy. Okay.
You might also hear the term scribomania.
Yeah.
It's pretty similar. Describes that same kind of compulsion.
Writing frenzy definitely paints a picture. But is this just like someone who really, really loves to write? Or does it get more clinical?
That's a great question, because there is a significant history within psychiatry. Yeah, back in the early 19th century, you had figures like Esquirol and later Eugen Bleuler.
Right, pioneers in the field.
Exactly. And they used graphomania to describe what they saw as, well, a problematic mental state.
How did it show up in this clinical sense?
Well, it would manifest as writing that's confused, often rambling thoughts. And this writing, sometimes it just loses all coherence. It can actually degenerate into, like, meaningless strings of words.
Wow, just noise on paper?
Pretty much. And that extreme form, it's sometimes called graphoria, or you might hear hypergraphia, which just means excessive writing.
So in that clinical view, it's not really about trying to communicate something specific or useful.
Precisely. The key thing is the compulsion, and often the lack of coherence. It's driven by this internal urge, not really a conscious desire to, say, share information.
Interesting.
And what's fascinating is how this really strong drive to write could signal something deeper going on mentally.
You mentioned other related terms earlier. What are some other ways this kind of intense connection to words and symbols can show up?
Yeah, good point. One related idea is typomania.
Typomania?
It describes this intense focus on seeing your own name in print, or just being excessively preoccupied with getting published.
Oh, right.
It can also mean a fixation on the visual side of writing, like typography, symbols, that kind of thing.
I can see the link there with graphomania. Both involve this really powerful engagement with the written word or print.
Exactly. There's a common thread.
Yeah.
And the sources we looked at mentioned a few others, too, just to broaden the picture.
Like what?
Well, there's logorrhea. That's an excessive flow of words, either speaking or writing, often repetitive. Then just verbosity, which is simpler, just using way more words than you need.
We all know someone like that, maybe.
Maybe. Hypergraphia. We mentioned that the compulsion to write or draw excessively, then slightly different but related, is bibliomania.
The book collecting obsession.
The obsessive collecting, exactly. And finally, graffiti, which is visual, of course, but it still involves that compelling urge to make marks, to write or draw on surfaces.
Right.
So all these kind of highlight different ways people can have an intense, maybe unusual relationship with communication and expression.
Okay, so we've got this clinical picture. Graphomania as confused, compulsive writing. But you said it's been used in other ways, too. This is where it gets really interesting, right? How else has the term been used?
Exactly. Beyond that strict medical definition, graphomania has been used more broadly, just to describe a really strong urge or need to write, whether you're a professional writer or not.
Okay.
And this is where we get into some fascinating critical and cultural takes on it.
Like Max Nordau, the source mentioned him having a pretty critical view. How did he use the term?
Yeah, Max Nordau. He was writing about what he called degenerate art.
Ah, that controversial idea.
Very. And he often used graphomania as basically a negative label for art he didn't approve of.
So who did he target?
He specifically went after artists like Richard Wagner, the composer, and French symbolist poets.
And what was his argument?
He essentially argued that their writing, which he saw as unconventional, excessive, was a sign of, like, mental or artistic decline, degeneracy.
Wow. So using a kind of quasi-medical term as an artistic insult.
Pretty much. It shows how a term like this could be, well, weaponized in cultural debates. It really highlights how subjective things like artistic value or what counts as excessive can be. It was a very judgmental way to use the word.
Right, so it shifts from being a clinical term to being ammunition in an art war. That's quite a leap. Now, what about Milan Kundera? He seems to offer a totally different perspective.
Completely different. Kundera, in his book, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, he gives this really compelling sociological reason for why he thinks graphomania inevitably takes on epidemic proportions in certain kinds of societies.
An epidemic. Okay. What drives that, according to him? He identifies three conditions, right?
Yes, three key societal conditions.
Lay them out for us. What are the ingredients for this epidemic?
Okay, so first he points to an elevated level of general well-being. Basically, a society where people have enough security and resources that they can afford to spend time on what he calls useless activities.
Useless meaning not essential for survival.
Exactly. Things like writing for personal expression, not just to, earn a living or communicate vital info. When basic needs are met, people have time for this stuff.
That makes sense. If you're struggling day to day, writing poetry might not be top of the list. What's the second condition?
The second is a high degree of social atomization. And flowing from that, a general isolation of individuals.
Atomization, meaning people are more disconnected, individualistic.
Yeah. In societies where people feel less tied to traditional communities or social structures, writing can become a really important outlet for processing thoughts, expressing who you are, maybe even fighting loneliness.
So writing as a solitary way to connect, almost.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And the third condition.
Yeah, that's the third way.
The third thing Kundera mentions is the absence of dramatic social changes in the nation's internal life.
Huh. Less drama means more writing.
That's his suggestion.
Yeah.
He makes this really striking comparison between France, which he saw as relatively stable internally at the time, and Israel, which was undergoing constant, significant social and political change. He observed that the percentage of writers seemed much higher in France.
Interesting. So his idea is that when life is less eventful on the outside, maybe that inner urge to create, to write, becomes stronger, or people have more space for it.
That seems to be the implication. A certain level of societal stability might actually fuel this widespread urge to write.
That France versus Israel comparison is really thought-provoking. Now, Cesio Mios also used the term, but in a totally different context again. Right?
Oh, completely different. Mios, in The Captive Mind, he's talking about writers in the Eastern Bloc under socialist realism.
Right, a very controlled environment for artists.
Extremely. And for writers trying to toe the party line, independent thinking, especially philosophizing outside the official ideology, was seen as dangerous.
So how did Graphomania fit in?
Well, according to Mios, if a writer failed to stick strictly to dialectical materialism, if they didn't constantly reference the approved propaganda, Mios puts it sarcastically, like failing to regurgitate Stalinist propaganda they risked being accused of.
Graphomania.
Exactly. Accused of a greater or lesser degree of graphomania.
So in that context, Graphomania wasn't about a personal compulsion at all. It was a political accusation.
Precisely. It was a label used to dismiss writing that was seen as too individualistic, too self-indulgent, not serving the state's ideological goals. Independent thought, personal expression that was framed as the excess, the madness, the sanity was sticking to the party line.
It's really striking how the same word, graphomania, can mean such different, even opposite things. A clinical symptom, a way to bash art styles, a comment on societal health, a political weapon.
It really shows the power of labels, doesn't it?
Definitely. Now, moving into fiction, the source mentions a character in a pretty famous novel who kind of embodies this.
Yes, exactly. In Mark C. Danielewski's novel, House of Leaves, which is quite a complex book.
Very complex.
Yes. The character Zampano is presented as someone suffering from graphomania. His extensive and often fragmented writings are absolutely central to the whole story.
So it provides a kind of literary case study.
It really does. It's a powerful fictional example of this obsessive urge to write that we've been talking about. It shows how these ideas we've discussed, the cultural filter into art itself.
A fictional portrayal like that can really make these abstract ideas feel more concrete.
Okay, now there's one more angle mentioned in our sources. Entopic graphomania. That sounds different again.
It is quite different. Entopic graphomania isn't about writing words, really. It's a drawing exercise. It comes out of surrealism.
Surrealism. Okay.
Yeah.
So how does this drawing technique work? Walk us through it.
Right. So you start with a piece of paper, could be anything, a page from a book, even a blank sheet,
Hmm.
and you look really closely at it. You're looking for any little distinguishing features, folds, creases, stains, maybe even just blank spaces that catch your eye.
Okay, so imperfections or just points of interest.
Exactly. Then you take a pen or pencil and you mark those points. You just put a dot on each feature you identified.
Got it. Mark the dots. Then what?
Once you have your collection of dots, the final step is to connect them with lines.
Any kind of lines.
Doesn't matter. Straight, curved, dashed, whatever feels right as you connect the points.
Okay, dots connected by lines. What's the point, though?
Yeah.
What's the idea behind doing this? Well, the core idea in surrealism, with end-topic Graphomania, is to try and uncover hidden patterns. Or maybe find meaning in what seems like random marks on the page.
Ah, finding order in chaos.
Sort of. By marking those seemingly random features and then actively connecting them, you're imposing a structure. You're creating something from these unintentional elements. It's a way to explore how we perceive meaning, how we make connections, even when there's no obvious intended design.
That's fascinating. So it uses the grapho part, the marking, but in a visual, almost abstract way.
Exactly. It plays with the idea of writing or marking in a very different sense.
Wow. So we've really been on a journey with this term, haven't we? From a psychiatric diagnosis
To a label used in art criticism,
to a way of thinking about society and writing.
even a political accusation.
And finally, a surrealist art technique. Graphomania has certainly worn many hats.
It really has. We've seen it evolve from describing a specific condition to being a tool, a lens, and even an inspiration across different fields.
So let's try and bring it all together. Graphomania, at its heart, is this powerful, sometimes uncontrollable urge to write.
Right.
Clinically, it can mean rambling, incoherent stuff, but the term's also used more broadly for just excessive writing, sometimes critically, sometimes as just maybe a result of how society is structured.
Exactly. And we see it pop up in literature and art, too, as this compelling idea about creativity and, well, human behavior.
It seems like the drive to create, to communicate with writing, it's just fundamental to us. And graphomania, in all its forms, represents maybe one extreme end of that spectrum.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's a fascinating extreme.
This whole deep dive really makes you think about your own relationship with writing, doesn't it? You know, have you ever felt that really strong pull, that almost urgent need to get something down in words? And thinking about graphomania, the clinical side, the critical views, the cultural takes, even the art exercise, how might that shed light on that feeling? That very human impulse to write definitely gives you something to mull over.